Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Welcome to my ritual night talk for July 13th. I'm Scott Stenwick, your host for these ritual night events that are hosted under the auspices of Leaping Laughter OTO in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Trying to get into that YouTube groove. So if you like these videos, like it. If you want to subscribe. If you want notifications, click on the notifications. And that way you'll always know when we're going live with these videos that we normally air 8 p.m. every Tuesday with either a ritual night talk or some kind of a ritual special event. Tonight, I also included the donation link in the description. Again, you know what to do. I mention it every time. We appreciate all you do to help support Leaping Laughter OTO. So tonight, what I'm going to talk about is the dangers of magic. And I just want to point out that in the snapshot on the video, you see me with my hand up. What this is actually a mudra that is used in Buddhism. And it means, and my understanding is that it means fear not. So that's my intent there. I'm saying fear not the dangers of magic. But I did want to cover this topic in a dedicated video because a number of the points I'm going to make tonight are points that that are scattered across different videos that I've made. But putting them all together in one place is more convenient because the question comes up a lot. Okay, when you have new people who are interested in magic, they ask, "Oh, is magic dangerous?" And so normally I'm the sort of person who tends to downplay that because, I have a background in experimental psychology. I work with statistics. I work with things like relative risk. And from the standpoint of relative risk overall, magic is not very dangerous. And let me explain what I mean by that, okay? The relative risk of getting in your car and driving to the store is low, okay? Most of us do stuff like that every day. You drive around, it's not really a big deal, right? But, if you look at what the odds are of automobile accidents, automobile fatalities, and stuff like that, I mean, there is a considerable risk that is, it's small, but it's not nothing. Every time you get in your car and you go to drive someplace, you don't know who else is on the road. Over the year of the pandemic, it seems like, and I hear more stories about people like driving crazy, and it seems like accidents are up. So if anything, like this last year, we've seen more traffic accidents and more traffic fatalities. But at the same time, it's not something that's, dangerous enough that it really gets in the way of how we live our lives. And so that's what I mean when I talk about relative risk. There is risk in getting in your car and driving someplace. But the risk is low enough that generally we don't really think too much about it. We don't think, oh, my car, but, I'd be afraid that. It's really not what our thought process is. And so magic, I would say, is similar to that. But lest I be unclear, I want to make sure that the idea that magic is absolutely without risk, that's not true either. I just think in terms of relative risk, it is a fairly straightforward thing on par with other things that we do going about our daily lives, and it is that are about as risky and that we don't give a lot of thought to. Magic, sometimes want to put it into like this kind of special box. You have the skeptics, they make the same kind of error with stuff like this where, there's this kind of unspoken assumption, or sometimes spoken even, directly addressed to people, where there's this kind of assumption that, well, if you can do one thing that's paranormal, you can do anything that's paranormal. And of course, that isn't true. Magic is governed by the laws of statistics as well. You can only push probability so much in a given direction before, the world starts pushing back. And so there are real limits that every magician has using magic. But I think that sometimes the idea that people get is that, well, falling into that same kind of thinking, they worry that, so I could do magic and there's some kind of a risk. But it's like, because magic could do anything could happen to me. And that's really not true, okay? Magic has limits, and, like every other, real phenomenon. And those limits really determine the extent to which things can happen in a magical context. So some real basics, okay? In a basic ritual, like the lesser banishing ritual, the pentagram, okay? We had some discussion of this, like over on one of the groups I'm on. Somebody, they'll like do the ritual for a short time, and I feel kind of weird. Should I stop happening? Am I going to have whatever? No, doesn't work that way, really. Or at least most of the time it doesn't. And much of what I'm going to say here is really a most of the time kind of analysis. Because, I'm sure there are outliers somewhere, but, things that don't happen to people who pick up magical practice. And if somebody says this to you, you should be a little concerned about them. Well, I started doing the lesser banishing ritual, the pentagram, and I did it for 2 days. And then this greater demon showed up and cursed my whole family, and now I'm screwed. What do I do? Okay. If somebody approaches you with something like that, that is not a real thing. Okay. Or it is so unlikely that a person would have to give serious proof that that was really what was going on. I mean, I'm not so far from the skeptics that I don't understand the idea that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. As a practicing magician who's seen a lot of things, my definition of extraordinary claims, I think, is a little different than, like what James Randi's would be, which is, anything paranormal is an extraordinary claim. And I don't necessarily see it that way, but it's an extraordinary claim in the sense of how magic actually works. It's like, that's just not something that generally happens to people. I mean, the function of the lesser ritual of the pentagram and the lesser ritual of the hexagram are that they're foundational rituals that you use to set up your working space. It's like creating your imaginary circle with the different god names that you're vibrating around. And it's basically just a place for you to work. The banishing function, can do things, kind of does some kind of house cleaning sort of stuff on your sphere of sensation. But in the case of the lesser pentagram, it's primarily a microcosmic ritual. And as a result, it's going to work mostly on the psychological level. And to the extent that it works on the energetic level, it can have some effects just kind of on your aura, extending a little bit beyond the bounds of your skin. It can do things like help get rid of obsessions and things, because some of those can have spiritual components. You can have things that are like kind of hooked into your sphere of sensation. Some New Agers do this thing of like cutting threads away. That's kind of a similar idea. But it is possible that various things you interact with could remain connected to you. Remember that, we're talking, when I talk about quantum information fields in magic, I talk about entanglement. Any two things that interact can become entangled. And so, and I am of the opinion, based on my model, that can happen at a higher level with situations, not necessarily just physical objects, because I think that my model of magic is based on the idea that quantum information structures can be fairly complex. So the thing about that, though, is that primarily what it does, it just works by kind of cutting the connection at the boundary of your aura. It's not something where, somebody, a really good magician, threw some kind of a spell at me and I want to avert it. So I'll do the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, and I'll banish it. It doesn't work that way. But consequently, it's also not such a powerful ritual that it's particularly dangerous. I would say doing the lesser ritual, the pentagram, is not dangerous at all. But, you can, but there are potential psychological effects. You're working with your aura, and there can be some cases where people develop issues from just about any kind of spiritual practice. But I will say this. I will say that something like the lesser ritual, the pentagram, to my way of thinking, is on par with something like meditation. Okay. Meditation is usually safe for the vast majority of people. However, there are some people who wind up having issues with it, either because of some sort of underlying psychological condition, or because they get stressed out about it in some way, or they get compulsive about it in some way. I mean, there are a lot of options of things that can happen, but most of them are not likely to happen. Okay. And so even if you do your lesser ritual, the pentagram, for a couple of days and you feel kind of off, okay, that's actually common. Okay. And unless that feeling of offness like keeps getting worse as you do the practice, probably you're fine, and probably it's going to resolve itself. When you bring in the lesser ritual, the hexagram, you are starting to work with macrocosmic forces. But remember, you're not really directing them at that point. What you're doing is you're creating a field, like a circle, where you can do magic. So essentially all you're doing with the lesser rituals is you're setting up a magical working space. And that, by the way, is why I don't like the lesser versus greater nomenclature, because the lesser is used to set up your foundational space, and then the greater, that's used to invoke or banish a specific thing. And so it's like, so the greater rituals correspond to what you're going to conjure, what you're going to invoke, what you're going to evoke, what you're going to work with. And the lesser rituals, they correspond to what your space does, right? So there's a real separation between the two. And, stuff like a basic daily practice, like doing a lesser banishing ritual, the pentagram, and then like a middle pillar, okay? That's, like I say, that's the kind of thing that's going to be about as safe as your regular meditation is. And there are limits in terms of things that can happen. Okay, you're not going to do this combination, and then you will spontaneously develop some kind of mental illness from doing magic. And that's not even true from higher magic, like conjuration magic, or even like Enochian magic, which I do a lot of. And the Enochian magic has this reputation that apparently, people go crazy when they do Enochian magic. There have been some cases of people who got obsessed with it in various ways. But I mean, I have never seen a case where somebody went and did, even like a huge Enochian operation, and develop some kind of a mental illness. That just seems to be kind of a silly thing, to the point where I would say that if somebody did some sort of huge magical operation and had some sort of psychological problem doing it, I would argue that the psychological problem was probably pre-existing, and it was activated in some ways by stress, because psychological problems can be activated by stress. And it's much more likely that it's going to be activated by stress than it is going to be activated by some sort of magic. But that being said, the caveat there, well, if you're really stressed out and freaked out about the magic that you're doing, maybe there is a potential there for some kind of problem to arise. What I like to mention when people bring up this idea of, and this is an old quote, I'm not sure who it's attributed to, but it's floating around the internet forever. The magician swims in the waters in which the psychotic drowns, okay? That contains so many sub-assumptions built into it. And there's so much stuff to it that is just, well, yeah, okay. You can get to the point where it's true in kind of a general sense, in that, both a person who is, suffering from a psychotic episode and a person who is doing magic are in states of altered consciousness, but they're also in states of altered consciousness that barely resemble each other. A lot of people have this idea that, magic is like, it's like the same thing as a hallucination, except like you're conjuring it or something. And there's a lot of ideas like that floating around, and really it's not. If you actually spend time with patients who suffer from psychotic conditions, and to compare that to what you're doing as a magician, there's absolutely no comparison. The level of randomness and disjointedness that you see in psychotic delusions, or alternately the obsessive elaborateness of them, like you see with paranoia and so forth, really are not anything like what you do as a magician. and they should not be anything like what you do as a magician. I mean, if you want to be effective about it and employ it as, both a spiritual path and a path for getting things done. Now, and by the way, I'm just going to bring this up. There's a few people in the magical community who are into this idea that, by the way, actually having exposure to patients that have had psychological issues, serious mental illnesses like psychosis, is that there's a book published by Julian Jaynes it's The Evolution of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. Apparently it's like real hip in magic, among magic people in some areas. And the idea is that, people in ancient times, they perceived the world like there was a separate voice telling them what to do. And that was like the voice of a god. And and the reason and it was perceived as this external thing. And the reason that Jaynes concluded that is that he looked at the samples of art from the ancient world and saw, well, it's written like that, where like the gods are talking to people and stuff. And so he was assuming that, or let's just say asking the question, what if this was a physiological thing? Okay, so we do have people today who hear voices, usually people who have schizophrenia of some form, and it appears to be a genotype. And so Jaynes essentially was postulating that maybe this genotype was a lot more common in the ancient world, and so people just went through life experiencing it this way. And the problem with that is just that those voices that people hear really get in the way of being able to just, live their lives. That's the reason they're considered serious mental illnesses. And a population of people like that, the idea that they could get much of anything done is highly questionable. I will say that there could be a sociocultural component in that perhaps people with those conditions in some areas, in some situations, might have been thought of as in some way in contact with the gods and may have been, brought off to temples to be taken care of and, relate, oracles and stuff like that, which were seen as psychic. And it could be just because a person has a condition like that doesn't mean they can't be psychic. They can also be psychic in addition, which makes it kind of interesting to tease that out. But sometimes they can get information that there's no other, at least it appears that there's no other way for them to get the information that they have other than by psychic senses, because, if you're talking about a hallucinated voice, it's entirely internal. How does that work? But anyway, so what you're doing as a magician is very, very different. You are not trying to induce a psychotic state. It's a completely different thing that you're doing. When you're looking into, when you're doing eyes open scrying, it's more like a form of controlled pareidolia. It's like you see Jesus at a piece of toast, that kind of thing. Jesus isn't actually on the toast, but there's this shape, right? And so if you've got a mirror, you got smoke in front of the mirror, it's this kind of randomized field. And so what's going to happen is based on what you're conjuring with, those greater rituals and all that kind of stuff, you're going to see some sort of a pareidolia matching to something that is like actually random in there, but it's going to correspond. The idea is it's going to correspond in some way to what you're doing. And so, that's really kind of how the eyes open scrying thing works. As I've mentioned, I've done it enough to know that it can work. And generally I don't employ that technique a huge amount because it's harder to do than like a spirit vision kind of thing. And which is like, close your eyes and visualize yourself projecting into the space where you've conjured the spirit. You can interact with it that way. Eyes open scrying with a mirror is more difficult. And as far as I could tell, the information I've gotten is no more accurate. So to understand this whole idea of magic and mental illness, one of the other things that people really don't seem to understand or don't seem to understand the implication of is that about a quarter of our population suffers from some form of mental illness. So 1 person in 4. If 20 or 30 people and you're like, I don't know anybody with mental illness, you're probably wrong. Okay. You probably know somebody who has it and just who, is good at, acting normal most of the time. okay? Because, I mean, this is known from an epidemiological perspective. It's like we have a huge population and we're talking 1 person in 4. So if a person were going to try to argue that magic causes mental illness, which is one of the more common dangers I see mentioned, right? They'd have to show that more than 1 in 4 magical practitioners have some form of mental illness. And I don't think that's true. I would not say that based on the people I've met. I would say that as far as I can tell, the percentage is fairly similar to the regular population. Now, if you're talking about things like stress triggering mental illness episodes, and magic actually can be used once you're good at it, you can use it to manage stress. But I want to be real, and so in theory, you can help that situation a little bit. But I like to be really careful about it because I want to make sure nobody thinks I'm advocating magic as magic is a replacement for actual treatment. You know, when I do healing stuff, magic is a complementary treatment that I use, and I find that it can improve outcomes, but it also isn't like the faith healers like, oh, I'll pray for you and I can heal people, but if you get any conventional medical treatment, it won't work. So it doesn't work that way. You know, it's like you get the conventional medical treatment, that's like your mundane steps of sending out a resume for a job. Then you do the magic on top of it to make the treatments more likely to work. You know, just like then you do a spell to help you actually be the candidate selected for the job. It's exactly the same thing. And this either or kind of thing is really not something that we want to be looking at. Now, I'm going to move on then, though, to what I would say is the most real danger of magic that is specifically related to the magic itself, okay? And what that is being sloppy with your charge in terms of your injunction and your limitation. That is where the danger lies. And if you're a newbie and you're starting out, it's probably not going to be a big deal because you have to actually first, in order for this to be a problem, you have to get good enough at magic that it works, okay? If you're not really good enough to get much of a shift from it, it's not really that dangerous. But if you are getting to the point where you're a good enough magician that you can, you could really cast and you could make some stuff happen. If you're careless about this, sometimes it can lead to eventualities that are going to cause you serious problems, okay? So I break magical charges up into 2 parts. First part is the injunction. The injunction is what you are actually casting for. This can be in a charge given to a spirit. It can be built into some kind of a charge that you are formulating and focusing on with your own psychic abilities. Both of those work. And this is a good practice for both of them. So the charge is, so I'm just going to be silly and I'm going to say, my charge is get me $1 million. Okay. It's the thing that you want. Okay. That's a really high end charge. People cast for $1 million fairly regularly. I don't hear of a lot of people getting it. Statistically, it's pretty hard. But what you want to keep in mind is that, you want to get the $1 million and like be able to do stuff with it and like be okay and, have your family be okay and stuff like this. So, like an easy way magically for you to get $1 million is say you have $1 million life insurance policy on a family member and they go to drive someplace. Well, I talked about cars, right? Cars are potentially dangerous. When you're out on the road, the likelihood of getting into an accident, getting killed in an accident, is non-zero. And so if that is the pathway that the magic can take, that's the pathway the magic is going to try to take. Okay? Because, well, I don't see any other easy way to get you $1 million, but I could do this over here. Okay? And this can happen with spirits that are thinking about stuff and acting on instructions, but it can also happen with psychic powers. And the reason is that magic, sending a probability shift out into the world is like pouring water down a hill. And what's going to happen is the water is going to take the path of least resistance. And so will the magic. It wants to get the biggest probability shift it can, so it's going to follow the path with the least friction. Now, what you do with the limitation is you cut that off, okay? So what you say is, the injunction is, bring me $1 million. And the limitation is, without injuring any of my loved ones, damaging my property, injuring myself, and so on. I mean, down the line of things that you don't want to have happen. Maybe, probably, if you have the life insurance policy, like you die and your family gets the money, that doesn't really fulfill the charge. But I mean, let's say that you had like some sort of like a death and dismemberment policy or something like that at work, which some people have. It's like, well, you could be in some work accident and be like disabled enough that they give you a huge amount of money, or maybe you could sue and there's a huge insurance settlement. But that's not what you want, okay? You want the $1 million, and you want the $1 million without stuff around you getting hurt, or without specific things around you getting hurt. You could maybe say something like, without injury to any of my loved ones. And well, actually you have some like uncle that you barely know someplace and they're in an accident and they have a life insurance policy. So about you're the beneficiary. I mean, I don't know. There's a lot of different permutations you can wind up with. But the point is that you want to cut off any of these pathways that the magic could take that, would be bad. And like I say, a common thing with that is insurance, either on, property, life insurance, and so on. It's like, I want, $200,000, and then there's this huge storm and it like basically totals my house. Well, I don't want my house totaled, so I got to put something in there. I don't want my property damaged, kind of thing. And so that can be an issue if you can build up a lot of magical power and energy. And if you cast and you say, just do this, you don't put a limitation on it, it means that the magic could potentially take any path it wants. And there's probably some paths that you're thinking about, that you're thinking, oh, well, that probably wouldn't be good if it happened that way. But put it into the limitation. I mean, if the fact of, that you take it and state it and put it into your charge, means that the magic is gonna have to behave that way. And, I also think that idea is the root of this notion that like spirits will try to trick you or whatnot, or like, they'll give you something that fulfills the letter of what you want, but not really the spirit of what you want. So you need to be really specific. And I do think that that mostly that's not because spirits are like deliberately coming out and messing with people. I think it's because you're saying, okay, well, I want this. So the spirit, well, it finds the easiest thing it can do that fulfills the charge. And if you don't have limitations, pointing, well, no, I want it to be this, 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 then what's going to happen is, cast a spell, I want a brand new car, okay? And you come home and there's like an old Matchbox car that's still in the box that just like fell in your driveway, okay? Magic is fully capable of doing stuff like that, but what are you going to do with a little model car? You want to make sure it's a car that you can drive, that you could use, that isn't going to cost you a bunch of money to fix, presumably because, if you get a car and then it requires all these repairs, it's like, well, presumably you didn't have the money to buy a car in the first place. That's why you're casting the spell. And so now you got to put all these repairs into the car. On the other hand, maybe that's workable if your cash flow is such that you have reliable cash flow, but not like a single big chunk of money or something like that. And you don't want to do it on credit. You could do a spell and not really worry about that, and probably wind up with an older car that needs some repairs. But once it's repaired, it's awesome. When I look for cars, that's a common thing that I wind up with. And so, but yeah, no, some of those cars are great. So anyway, the point is that being specific is helpful, and it's especially helpful once you're actually good at magic. Because, if you're a beginner and your probability shift you're throwing is kind of small, it's probably not going to be big enough to cause any serious damage or injury either. But, as you get better, you start to get overconfident, you get a little careless. that is a potential danger of magic. And there aren't a lot of other things that have that kind of danger associated with them. Magic is kind of unique in that regard because it addresses and works with probability directly. But, other than that, I mean, if you keep those things in mind, though, again, getting back to the concept of relative risk, magic is fairly straightforward if you take precautions. Another piece of advice I give people is to always use some sort of a containment structure, like a trithemian, the table of practice, like a triangle from the Goetia, that one works. I use the Sigillum de Amath from Dee's Enochian system a lot. And for other than Enochian magic, it works quite well for as a general table of art type structure. And my recommendation there is, this is specific to people who are doing negative magic. So this is another danger that shows up if you're going to be the kind of person who's going to go out and curse people. I don't recommend you going out and cursing people most of the time. Every so often, there's a situation that absolutely needs to be dealt with, and that's that, right? But I find that certainly at this point in my magical career, and probably I would have been better off doing this for, a couple of decades, is looking at it from the standpoint of using my magical power instead of just to hurt someone else or make somebody else's life worse without really any benefit to me at all. I should really use the magical power that I have, because there is a limit, and there's only so much you can really push around. I would rather focus on using it to make my own life better. But it is true that if you do cursing in just like an open circle without some kind of a containment structure to hold the energy and provide kind of a little pocket universe for the spirit that you're talking to, what can happen is it could be like doing working with radiation without shielding. It's like, well, it's hard to work with it without getting some on you. I've talked about how I don't believe in the idea of the threefold law, because I don't believe that it amplifies or anything like that. But it is true that, if you are casting something that's designed to cause someone, bad luck in whatever way, okay, it's very possible, if you don't contain what you're doing, that some of that bad luck will stick to you, and you'll be kind of unlucky too. Your target is going to get most of it, but you do want to be kind of careful. And since it's really easy to just get one of these, stick it in the center of your altar, and I mean, you're basically done. And so it's not really that complicated. The other advantage to it, which is separate from that, is that it focuses the power of the magical operation. So even in a case where you're doing something like a healing spell, getting some extra healing energy on you isn't really a big deal. Maybe you had a cold, then after the ritual, I feel like I'm over my cold, or something minor like that. But if you're conjuring into a containment structure and you have a magical link to a target that you're trying to heal, using the containment structure also means that all of the force of the operation is going to go to the target, because anything that gets on you doesn't get on them. That's more how it works than a threefold law kind of thing. It's like you can summon up a probability field of quantity X, but if then X gets divided into, whatever's on you, and then to the target is X minus whatever that value is, your ritual is going to be less effective, and your outcome isn't going to be as good. And so, in addition to being a protection against one of the dangers of magic, the containment structure is helpful in general for amplifying the power of operations. But again, back to relative risk. Horror movies like say, you said one word wrong and the demon jumps out of the wall. Not a real thing. Usually you do a spell and you make a bunch of mistakes and it backfires and does something totally different than what you were even trying to do. That really doesn't happen either. The deal is that usually when you mess up a spell, and spells do get messed up, every spell I do isn't perfect either. But usually what happens is that if you mess up a spell like that, just nothing's going to happen. You're not going to get a probability shift in any direction. And, you're not going to have some, bizarre horror movie consequence, come at you. And that is not something you should even worry about. You shouldn't be so wrapped around the axle of, it must be done absolutely perfectly. And if I make a mistake, well, that's a recipe for, going into the practice already with this kind of, fearful, stressful mindset. And from a psychological standpoint, that's just not good for spiritual practice. Like meditation. I mean, if you sit down and go into meditation and you're feeling that way about your meditation, you maybe shouldn't do it, because part of the point of meditation is a thing called the relaxation. And if that gets triggered, if you're all tense and freaked out about what could happen to you in meditation, anxieties or things, you really want to get over them doing magic. And the easiest ways to get over them doing magic, understand, real dangers are, accept that, you're willing to take that level of relative risk forward, and don't let people on the internet telling you what you're doing is dangerous, feel kind of off. And then, oh, I felt kind of off, so I need to stop doing it. You don't want to be there either. It's a matter of just keeping going with this will kind of even out. A lot of the time at the beginning, you're kind of different. And so, of course, the last danger of magic is basically getting what you want. Okay. And here's why it's a danger. I mean, I don't think it's a danger. I think it's awesome. It's why I do magic. But it is true that as you work magic, what's going to happen is you're going to slowly start tuning your life more so it's in harmony with your will. And there could be some things in your life that you're completely okay with, but on some sort of a deep bit of harmony with, who you are as a person. I've had that happen with jobs. It's like I had a job, didn't give it a second thought, did a kind of a ritual to send. I started having problems at this job, and I eventually wind up leaving this job. And the next job I get is much, much better. To some extent, it's like, well, you want to have that kind of, faith, if you want to call it, but you can measure it. You do things, you look at things that happen, and but it's more like, your nature, as a star, and the nature of your will, that, if you go in that direction, your magic is going to propel you through whatever obstacles, whatever things need to change in your life, whatever things need to be, and you're going to get to a place where you're better off than you were before. By some of the things that I've been through over the years, I would say you just have to persevere on the other side, and you will be better off eventually. Though sometimes going through some of those obstacles and processes aren't fun. You're tempted, oh, maybe I should, stop. Don't stop. Focus. Okay. Keep up with the practices. And that's really how you get somewhere on the magical path, both in terms of the magical path as the Western system of enlightenment, and the magical path as a way in which you can use your consciousness to manipulate probabilities and situations in your life in harmony with your will. So I'm going to stop there for tonight. Hopefully this has been a useful overview. I probably will refer some people back to this video at some point when they ask about dangers of magic and stuff, because I think I've done a pretty comprehensive job talking about that kind of stuff. And so with that, thank you all very much for watching, and have a great rest of the evening. Love is the law, love under will.